Welcome to Team Futurism. Today I am joined by Naum Milyavskiy. Naum is a filmmaker based in Los Angeles. Naum, thanks for coming on the show.
Glad to be here.
So I was just last night poking around on Redfin, and I noticed that there's like a shocking number of houses available and not as insanely overpriced as I might have imagined. And this is kind of curious to me because I am actually thinking about at some point in my life moving to LA. And the talk was that as after the fires hit, all the home prices were going to skyrocket and nothing was going to be available. Just like spending 15 minutes on Redfin last night, it seems like the opposite is true. Is there like a reality to this situation? Is now a good time or a terrible time to move to LA? Do you have any sense of this?
I have heard the opposite, that there
Okay.
have been like steep hikes, like almost like illegal, unethical hikes in pricing. Um, I don't know. But
Interesting.
from like a production standpoint, I feel like the industry has been in the gutter for a few years now, and the
Yeah.
motto is kind of survive till 25. So whatever, percentage of LA is entertainment, which I honestly don't think in the grand scheme of things is like a huge percentage. But some of those people might have left, and just kind of went home or moved out of state or honestly pivoted careers and no longer need to be based in LA.
I could see that. Yeah, I did stumble across this New York Times article that I sent to you earlier in the week, and it was titled, "There's a Feeling We're Not in Hollywood Anymore." And it was all about this idea that Los Angeles, this is an old story at this point, but it
Mhm.
used to be the hub for film globally. And now it's ranked like fourth or fifth in terms of the best place to film because it's just insanely expensive and there's way more red tape to film
Mhm.
in LA rather than just like other states or Canada or overseas. Here's a quote that I guess I wanted to read from the
Mhm.
article. This is Michael Miller Jr., who oversees film and television production for the union, said that roughly 18,000 full-time jobs have evaporated in the past 3 years, primarily in California. He says, quote, "We are allowing California to become to the entertainment industry what Detroit has become to the auto industry." Do you ever see that happening? Or do you think that this is just like overblown and because of the weather in LA and all the beautiful people that are just there that it's going to, carry on? Or what's your sense?
I think that the whole Detroit analogy is definitely overblown. I wish I had like a bird's eye view of the economics so I could speak to it better, but like my intuitive sense is that just talking to the people I've talked to over the past months about this problem, um, almost everyone I've met that's working in LA has gotten a significant opportunity through some kind of chance encounter,
Mhm.
whether it's a networking event or they honestly live close to someone, or mother's friend connected them after running into someone. But I think that there's very much a premium on sharing a space locally with the people that do the things you want to do, that are like both below you a little bit in your career and above you. Um, so yeah, I mean, in terms of community, I think the creative community is robust here, and the Detroit analogy just doesn't make any sense on that front. Economically, there's a strong argument to be made that like tax incentives are really pushing people out of the state. So I don't know.
Yeah, the Detroit analogy is, though it's a bright, shiny object, and it seems very obvious until I think you're right, you pick at it a little bit, because Detroit was just a manufacturing hub. It wasn't necessarily like a brain hub or like a creativity hub. It wasn't North Beach in the 1960s with the hippies or whatever,
Yeah,
right? Where everyone had to be reading each other's books and literally getting high and drunk together every night to participate in what the thing was. LA
yeah,
is more like North Beach in that it is kind of just like, a bunch of people making art together, and that you do have to kind of like feed off each other, know each other. And it's, I mean, it's a cliche, but it's super true. I think that it is just kind of like who you know in LA at some level,
Yeah.
right? And I don't think that is true at all for the Detroit model.
I think that you could have a viable career if you seeded your career here in LA and then you moved somewhere cheaper and continued to work remotely and fly in intermittently. You know what I mean? But to break in, I still think that's very important to be here. And you're right that like it's about the cultural kind of intellectual sphere and not like the infrastructure, like literal factories. I guess studios to some degree were able to be built here because of the space and the weather. So
I just read this book called Yuck, and I wrote a little review of it, and it was about the Joshua Tree and how what a strange like part of California history that was. How everyone who came over the a pioneer or whatever you might call them, and came in and settled in the LA basin. They all passed through Joshua Tree, the desert there, and they saw these trees as like the most hideous, most like ugly and grotesque plants on the planet. And so every time the Joshua Tree was mentioned, it was always mentioned as like the world's ugliest tree. And it's kind of interesting to me because now and this is what the book was about, over just the past decade or two, because of like millennials and Instagram, all of a sudden that part of the world is considered extraordinarily magical and beautiful. And we don't see Joshua trees as grotesque anymore. We see them as like actually kind of beautiful. So there's like a famous picture of Miley Cyrus climbing one. My essay was actually titled "Don't Climb the Joshua Trees" because you're not supposed to.
yeah,
But it is kind of interesting that millennials have this capacity to make things or to see beauty and magic in a place where it wasn't there before. And so like traditionally we've always said that the LA basin, like this one particular spot, is so uniquely gorgeous for film. But like all it takes is a couple of Instagram influencers, and then all of a sudden, some like previously grotesque part of the world could become the next it spot, the next like beautiful place. So, maybe even the cliche that LA is the place to be because of like how uniquely gorgeous it is. That might at some level be overturned just based on how people perceive the world in a different way as the generations progress.
I was just talking to someone. I have a Joshua Tree T-shirt, and they commented on it, and they were saying, "Oh, I'm going out this weekend," and they were talking about how beautiful it is. So, I don't know how you could call it ugly. That doesn't make sense in my mind. But I do see that like next to like a giant redwood, or even like a forest, like the kind of traditional like outdoorsy image that comes to mind. Like the Joshua Tree kind of seems weak in comparison, or like there's more to be desired. But I think the charm is how like Spartan the tree is. It's very like bare and simple, and that's kind of like the beauty of the desert. So it's I don't know, it's interesting. There's a charm to it, but it's definitely not like, it doesn't have that awe factor, the gorgeous like factor that like the redwoods have.
There's a little bit of a the grass is always greener on the other side element, because I'm from Washington State, which is just like full of evergreen trees. It's like everywhere you look, it's green. It's just always green. And we would always have people, there's always that one couple that moved into the neighborhood from LA. Everywhere I lived, there was always like, oh, that house was just bought by someone from LA. Mm-hmm. And they would come in and they would talk about how gorgeous this area was. And I was be like, what are you talking about? This place is hideous. It's gray all the time. It rains nonstop. Like, it's hideous up here. There's something just about like being like seeing something new. It just with fresh eyes if you're not from there, for sure.
100%. Yeah.
But yeah, maybe just like to close the note on LA. I do think it's a special and magical place. And there is something about the fact that, I don't know, like it just does draw ambitious people. Like coastal regions always do. They draw ambitious people in a way that non-coastal places just simply don't. Like what percentage, like 70% of the world's population lives near a coast or something like that. And ambitious people go where high population densities are. So I don't think LA, for a number of reasons, that just being a few of them, will ever like actually die or anything, even if this one industry does like slowly bleed away. There's just too much going on there. It's not going to die. But I do think it's definitely going to not be the same place 10 years from now. I think that's probably a pretty safe assumption.
Yeah, I mean, the internet has kind of wreaked havoc on traditional Hollywood production in so many ways.
Yeah.
Streaming, I feel like tech has just kind of revolutionized what entertainment means, and it's a lot more distributed. It's a lot more accessible. People are a lot more online now, and I think that's affected the culture, and it's going to continue to affect it.
Okay, well, speaking of film, I'm actually having you on today to talk about your new project that you've been working on for quite some time, and it is being released. I believe you said next month. I'll let you, give the true intro here, but it's called Rage for Falcons, and you're going to be releasing it as a series on YouTube. Before we really get into it, can you give like a high-level overview of this project?
Yeah, so it's a project about a few California falconers who have been doing falconry their entire lives, more or less. And it kind of follows them through one season and explains kind of what their draw is to the sport and just like the difficulties of it, the commitment to the lifestyle. It was originally intended as a feature film. It was supposed to be my first feature. And as I went out to get funding for it, talking to producers, applying for grants, I feel like it was just such a hyper competitive environment, and producers were so reluctant to fund projects and take risks. It kind of started to stall, and I started to get really frustrated that I didn't have the funds, even though I had the entire film in my mind. And so I basically went out a few times to get footage for like sample reels and put together like a short little reel that I was using to pitch it. And as I was continuing to apply to grants and not getting like positive responses, or getting positive responses but not getting selected, I just kind of had a paradigm shift, and I was like, you know what? I've been shooting a lot of this on my Sony mirrorless camera. It's a hybrid Sony. It's not quite Netflix quality, but it's like 90% Netflix quality, I'd say, if you build it out. And I was just like, you know what? No one's really giving me the green light. Like, I don't really want to wait for permission anymore. I want to like release this into the world. And I think the big thing for me that really pushed me into shooting myself was that my series was time bound, or the film was time bound. It was a whole season I was supposed to spend with these falconers. And who knows how many seasons they have left. They're kind of in the twilight of their careers.
Oh,
So
interesting.
I had to go out, I had to shoot, and then I was like, whatever I get, I'm going to cut into something. And it turns out YouTube was the perfect format.
One thing that I love about this, and I want to just flag it so we can talk about it later, is the connection that you draw with our relationship to this particular creature and how that might inform our relationship with AI going forward. And that's an element that is very much baked into what I've seen of the series. So I'm excited to talk a little bit about that, because I know you have thoughts about that. But first, I have a couple of maybe dumb questions that I've never asked before. So
Yeah,
bear
sure.
with me. And maybe anyone listening probably has the same questions of falconry in general. I mean, it's something you just don't hear about. So there's a season, like, and it's a sport. Explain that. How is the seasonal, and how is it a sport?
Yeah.
I always
Okay.
thought it was a hobby, right? I always thought like you own a falcon, and then like when you feel like it, you go out, you take it out into a field, and you like catch a mouse or something like that. But clearly,
Yeah.
there's more going. There's more organization to this, apparently.
You're going to see very quickly when you start watching the series that it's not a hobby. I mean, that I've heard the countless times I've heard falconers actually say that to me word for word is it's not a hobby, it's a lifestyle.
Hmm.
It's like burned into my
Hmm.
brain. Um, the story I've heard them tell, I feel like it's circulated around the community because they all kind of have their lore around how to talk about falconry. They talk about like having a rifle And like you go out for hunting season, you shoot some duck or something, and then you hang it up and you forget about it until the season comes around again. Falconry is just completely different because you have to continue caring for these birds. You have to continue paying attention to them. It's a year-round kind of commitment, even though the season itself, basically, just to back up, the season in falconry correlates with the temperature kind of dropping in the fall, where the birds start migrating. And I couldn't tell you exactly what those migration patterns are, but I know a lot of the birds come down south, and they just hunt, like they pass through these fields and they hunt for months up until like March or April, and then they go into molt, which is basically when they start switching out their feathers. And it's kind of dangerous for a bird to be hunting and flying when it's molting because it's got like blood fed into its feathers. So if it snapped one of them, it could actually bleed out. So during the molt, it actually is basically like a hibernation where they're not really active.
Interesting. So they don't really even eat during that period?
In captivity, like kind of with the falconers, they don't really fly them at all, I don't think. They might like maybe fly them from perch to perch and they feed them. I wonder in the wild if they just kind of eat at a low capacity because they're not expending a lot of energy. They're still hunting, but they're not like hunting daily. That's a good question. I don't think they don't eat entirely, but their hunting is probably like radically reduced.
Nature is so strange. It is just the strangest thing.
Yeah.
So and they like compete with each other, the falconers, right? They have competition.
So not typically.
Okay.
They're generally a kind of competitive bunch, I'd say. But there's a particular competition called the Sky Trials, which I was able to join back in January. And it's essentially a competition that was born out of this like bet that a pigeon fancier had, that like another guy's falcon couldn't catch his fastest pigeon. And so they like put on a bet and people watched. And then that became like a reoccurring competition, and they like set out the rules and criteria. And now it's like pretty formalized.
Interesting.
So every year in California, sometimes the meets are like in Nevada and other parts of the just California, Nevada, that area. But they drive out to like an undisclosed location that you kind of find out the morning of, and they hold this competition where they release pigeons and watch their falcons go after them.
What a wild thing. So how long have you actually been filming this? It's been a couple of years, I believe now, right?
Well, my first project, you were talking about the AI stuff. I came into contact with the falconry community as like a real like newbie who knew very little. I had read H's for Hawk. I had been to a few bird refuges like back when I was studying abroad in England. And then I just reached out kind of at random and came to a workshop. And at the time, I wanted to create a hybrid documentary that could explore this question of like how we bond to other creatures and animals, and AI was kind of in that umbrella. And I saw like the falconers as like perfect models to like explore those ideas, because they were like forming these relationships with like feelingless animals, essentially. Like,
yeah,
you don't
birds
really have
are very feelingless. They're very like dead inside and alien looking, right? But they still form these very. There's a quote in the intro episode that I just watched last night where this woman who was very clearly very, very passionate about falconing, but is that the right word? Falconing? Is that how you say it?
falconry.
Falconry.
You could say hawking. They say hawking.
Hawking. Okay. Yeah. So she's very a passionate hawker, hawking. She has this moment where she's saying that she emotionally does lean on this animal. Like very often, like the animal will lean on her, the hawk, but like she leans on it when she was going through some hard time. And it is this fascinating moment where I mean, like, it does speak to the idea that humans need not only like each other necessarily, but like we form bonds, like, and close meaningful bonds with also quasi inanimate objects, but that are also like alive in some strange way.
Yeah.
And yeah, definitely parallels there with technology. But it's very interesting because it definitely did. It wasn't any. If someone says that about AI, it's like this cringy, like, oh my god, teenagers, set down your phones. You don't have a real relationship with like this bot or something. Like, the parallels there. It's because the hawk at some very big almost knows less than an AI or something like that. Not
Yeah.
really. It's different forms of knowledge or something, but like, it's very interesting to see because you don't go like, oh my god, that's so weird. You go, oh, that's so sweet. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I think the difference, as I've spent time away from that project and kind of thought about it even more over the years. That was back in 2021, by the way. Um,
Okay.
I've kind of been trying to understand, like what if an animal's biological, even though it's not giving you much in terms of affection, there's some kind of affinity you have to it because it's like a biological creature that's kind of evolved with similar kind of mechanisms somewhere down the line. So I think people were really jarred by this like connection I was making about like comparing a biological thing to a non-biological thing. But I think the point I was trying to make really, and this is like pretty heady stuff, and it was like my first major project, so it was a lot to attempt, but I was trying to kind of show that a lot of the relationship a lot of the relationships that people form with animals just depend on their own projection, which is like the very basis for why you would feel emotionally connected to a chatbot, knowing
Right.
it's not feeling, it doesn't have feelings or emotions. So like in the case of Kate, where she talks about it was an owl. She said she came out of surgery after kind of battling cancer for a long time. She comes out of the hospital, and the owl is just kind of there silently with her. And all her friends around her were trying to comfort her with words, and that's not what she wanted. She wanted like a solitary presence, just like something quiet and present, but not like effusive with words. And she found that the owl, by not having like language and not having all these like emotive capacities, actually created a space for her to be sad.
I have this theory that everything is, this is something I go back to, but like everything is kind of like a story, and stories are very much tied into mythology at some level. And birds are a big part of human mythology. They have been like, gods at certain times for certain cultures. They still crop up in like child cartoons as like, my daughter watches Little Bear and Winnie the Pooh, and like the owl is always like the wise character.
Mhm.
And like, there are other cartoons where like the hawks or the eagles are like, the fierce, strong ones. So we anthropomorphize these creatures and we mythologize them. And the human brain is such that when we see something like a falcon, or we live with it, or any pet for that matter, all of that mythology is just like somehow there in our brains when we're interacting with any given creature. And so I do think that there's like so much that is there underneath the surface that we're really kind of like interacting with. And we do this also with stories. When we read a novel, we have kind of relationships with it, completely fictional characters. And I think that AI and chatbots and robots are somewhere in there too, because they have been part of our stories long enough that they too are also kind of sort of part of our mythology, with like R2D2, or just like the whole pantheon of like famous, quote unquote, like famous AIs that we do kind of have like this mythical relationship to. So we do
Mhm.
kind of like project all of that onto the idea of having a relationship with a robot too, in the same way that we do with biology, even though it is different. Like, the mythology that we map onto something like a hawk is something that is just like been with our species for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and there's like, it's very rich.
Mhm.
Whereas something like when you're projecting this like newer mythology onto something like forward looking, it might be based on the Jetsons you watched that was written in the 1980s or something. I'm not too sure. But yeah, it's a parallel mechanism at some point. Like it's a mechanism based on like language and mythology or something.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, a lot of these falconers do have, yeah, I would say like a kind of mythical appreciation for these animals. I mean, some don't, but the most falconers are like quite spiritual, in my opinion. Like, and I think that's probably because they spend so much time outdoors and they're just more connected to the environment more than they're like reading, books about, you know, Carlos Castaneda and things like that. But yeah, yeah, it's a really interesting.
It's interesting. They strike me a little bit. Just speaking of fictional characters, the falconers that I've seen in some of your work, they do seem kind of like Steinbeck characters. They seem like they're directly out of a Steinbeck novel, like very tied to the earth and very like in the moment and kind of at peace with just whatever is going on. Is that part of it, or is there more of like a hunting subculture? Like we are like hunting, or so, like what tell me about the culture a little bit more. And also, is there any like youth element here, or is it all just kind of old timers? Because you mentioned that it might be going away.
Yeah, I think the culture depends on like which circle you talk to. The most time I spent was with people in their kind of like 50s, 60s. They're the ones that are mentoring the next generation. And I'd say the biggest cultural difference between like new falconers, and there are a bunch of them, and old falconers is that the older falconers were very consciously trying to keep their sport under wraps. And weren't like conspicuous about their falconry on like intentionally. Whereas now with social media, like the falconers call these guys like the TikTok falconers, the ones that will like, shoot TikToks and all sorts of videos on social media of them like doing things like car hawking, which is like riding with your bird and releasing it from the car after like you drive and build some speed. So you're basically giving your bird an advantage as you're hunting with it. Which like is kind of the parody of a falconer. So I'm not saying obviously not all young people are doing that, but there's a kind of respect, there's a tradition, and there's a secrecy to the older generation that's just very different from the younger generation, which is just more out with it, kind of a little more showy, and has a little bit more of like bravado about what they do.
Interesting. That actually reminds me of, if you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen. This reminds me something I stumbled across on Twitter right before we hopped online. I thought that this was fascinating, and I've seen this online before. I don't think this is like anything new, but this is a little chart that says the rise of dopamine culture. And so on the left here, we're looking at things like athletics, journalism, video, music, images, communication, relationships. And across the top, there are these columns, slow traditional culture, fast modern culture, and then on the far right, dopamine culture. And so what you were just talking about there with the newer, younger falconers who come out making this like a TikTok endeavor versus like the old time falconers who it's very much more of just like an earthy endeavor. I can map that out on this chart. if you see, let's say, athletics, it's kind of a sport. Slow traditional culture is playing a sport, whereas dopamine culture is you gamble on a sport, right? Mm-hmm. So there's definitely a little bit of that. And with music here, it actually says like creating albums versus TikToks. I think that there is something to this. I think it's very oversimplified. Someone actually noted in the first comment here, it's a comment that I really like about how right now sports are like at an all-time high, and people still get, I think, like real, legit, long-lasting dopamine hits off of playing sports in a way that just can't be simulated. I don't think that there's any like online version of a sport that just like really gives you that you actually feel healthy in a very like, you know, overcoming death sort of way when you play a sport versus when you watch it or gamble on it. So I don't think that like we're at all moving away from any of these like slow traditional cultures. They're all still there, I think, at some level. But yeah, the dopamine culture, at least the stereotype, is that younger generations are all in on the dopamine culture to the detriment of anything that's like slower and more meaningful. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about this chart.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen this chart a bunch of times. I agree with it generally. I think with respect to falconry, the fact that there are TikTok falconers just means like in an age where you kind of jockey for attention in a new way that like we've never done before, really. When you have a giant freaking eagle on your arm, it's pretty easy to gain attention online. So I mean, we're looking for new ways to gain status and attention through our media, and I think Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, whatever. I think it gives people an easy route to that. But it is exactly opposite of what the falconers valued before, which was like secrecy and just keeping things hidden. Like there's a lot of logic to that too. I think people who practice falconry early on were worried about the sport getting shut down. Were worried about the perception.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So now it's like there's a way in which like there's so much controversy about everything that I think people who post on TikTok don't really have the same like skepticism for media because we're just so flooded with it. Whereas like when I talk to the older heads, they're vetting what I'm putting out, and they're asking me to send them rough cuts, which I, gave them my word I'd do, to make sure that there was nothing that was weird or I wasn't depicting them in any problematic way. Whereas I think just younger people don't care as much.
Yeah, that's definitely true, right? Yeah, I think that that's really true. As I'm just like looking at this chart, it seems like the one that has very much almost gone away is handwritten letters. That is such an absolute thing of the past that I just saw.
It's funny you say that, because in one of the episodes, one of the guys talks about the bonds between falconers, and he goes, people were writing letters to each other across states. He goes, grown men were writing letters across states to each other to connect over falconry, which was like, it's fun. It's just funny you mentioned letters, because that's really how they used to find each other.
That is so interesting. Yeah, I was actually thinking about, I saw an article in the New York Times or the Atlantic yesterday about apparently there's a new book of letters of Joan Didion being released, I think right now. And her family's a little upset about it because she was very secretive with her life and she didn't want to share much about like her personal life. And she is very like, she's totally in control. I think that the article said about like her image. Mm-hmm. And these letters that she wrote were never meant to be made public, and she would just be mortified if these were made public. And that's such an interesting thing about how, one, in this exact case, modern writers don't need to worry about that because we're not sitting around writing letters to each other or to our family. But to the extent we do have letters that are being written, they're digital and they're all like public anyway. I wonder if the book of collected letters will just cease to exist as a thing 50 years from now, when the modern crop of writers aren't going to have that like you open up their home when they've passed away and you find that like the chest of letters, like it's just not going to be there.
Mm-hmm. Oh, definitely not. How many letters have you written?
I used to keep a bunch of notebooks, and I still have all of them, like actual like notebooks, but they're not letters to people. So yeah, they're just like my demented scribblings to myself, I guess. So kind of like none, I think, right?
Yeah.
Like birthday cards to my mom, but otherwise
Right.
none.
Right. I lived abroad for a while and I sent some letters back and forth to people, but that was it. Um,
That's true. I did that too when I was like 20 in London for a couple of months. Maybe that was the one time in my life where someone should find those and track them down. Maybe they're brilliant.
mm, mm.
Uh, so it sounds like, if I have this right, you're going to be releasing the new series in May. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm kind of like in post-production stages now and just putting the finishing touches on it. So I don't have a set date, but May's a good bet, like early to mid-May.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were talking about before we hit record that I'm going to try to have you on the Substack live to do an actual release when that actually happens, and we'll drop links. I'll also come back and make sure I have links on here if anyone listens to this at a later time. So I'll definitely be excited to help you promote this, because from what I've seen, it's not like anything I've really ever seen before, and just in terms of like this community, it's very unique. And it's very gripping too. It pulled me right in. So yeah, it's going to be exciting to share.
Yeah, I think the big thing that changed the nature of it was like the first person perspective. I never intended to be in it as a character. But then going the YouTube route, I had to like kind of pull myself into the foreground, which was the big shift. So yeah, that first episode that you saw, the episode 0, was never supposed to be a part of the original film, but given I'm putting it on YouTube, I gave like a huge explainer with my story. So that should get people caught up to speed.
That's actually interesting. I didn't realize you didn't initially plan to be part of the film like that, because it did seem so natural and so kind of like obvious. So in that sense, I think that the project benefits from it being released on YouTube, because it seems like a I don't know, it adds a lot. It doesn't detract, it adds for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. Well, thanks again for coming on. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for talking. Appreciate it.